I never expected my first step into the grand ballroom to feel like walking into a trap. The chandeliers glistened above, music swelled softly, and every pair of eyes seemed to turn toward me at once, not with welcome, but with a collective gasp. Before I could even greet anyone, she was already marching toward me. The CEO's fiancée, dressed in an opulent white gown that looked as if it had been stitched from moonlight itself, stopped just inches from my face. Her perfectly manicured hand clutched her bridal bouquet, trembling, not from nerves, but from fury. "Look what you've done," she hissed, holding the bouquet high enough for everyone to see the missing white roses. "You ruined it." Her voice was sharp enough to slice through the room's music. Conversations halted, the air tightened, and I could feel the heat of 100 whispers gathering around me. I froze, my fingers still clutching the small gift I had brought, suddenly feeling heavier than lead. I hadn't even touched her bouquet. I had barely crossed the door, but truth rarely matters when the accusation comes from someone with power. Somewhere in the crowd, I caught sight of him, the CEO, standing near the head table. His expression shifted from polite detachment to something sharper, more dangerous. He began to move toward us, each step deliberate, his gaze locked on the scene like a man walking into a storm. My pulse pounded in my ears. I didn't know if he was coming to defend her, or to stand against me. The murmurs swelled like a tide I couldn't escape. I could see guests leaning toward each other, lips curling into knowing smirks, as though they had been waiting for the spectacle all along. My throat tightened, but I kept my chin high, refusing to shrink under her glare. The bouquet in her hands looked pristine to me, every petal in place, but she angled it toward the crowd as if displaying undeniable proof of my guilt. "Do you think you can walk in here and not face the consequences?" she spat, her voice dripping with disdain. My fingers curled around the small wrapped box I'd brought as a quiet gesture of goodwill. Now it felt like a weapon I had no right to carry. The air between us was electric, charged with her intent to humiliate me in front of every important figure in the room. Then, over her shoulder, I saw him closing the distance. The CEO's black tuxedo seemed to cut through the haze of gossip, his eyes trained solely on me. He didn't look at the bouquet, nor at the guests, only at my face, searching for something in my expression. My heartbeat was a drum in my chest, a mix of dread and a strange flicker of hope I didn't dare name. Every step he took seemed to slow time, stretching the moment into something unbearable. The fiancée straightened, clearly ready to deliver her final blow before he arrived. I braced myself, unsure if his presence would silence her or crush me completely. He stopped just beside her, the space between them thick with unspoken tension. The guests shifted in their seats, a hush settling over the room as if everyone sensed something unexpected was about to happen. His gaze moved briefly to the bouquet in her hands, then back to me, and for a moment I thought I saw his jaw tighten. "Is this really what you want to do here?" "Now," he asked her, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable edge. She blinked, momentarily thrown off, but quickly recovered, holding up the bouquet as evidence. "She ruined it. My bouquet. Do you think that's acceptable?" she said, as though reciting lines she'd rehearsed. He didn't answer her directly. Instead, he reached into the arrangement of flowers decorating the altar, plucked a fresh bouquet, and crossed the room toward me. My breath caught. He held it out, his eyes never leaving mine, the gesture deliberate and defiant. "Here," he said simply, his voice steady. The room seemed to inhale all at once. I hesitated, my fingers brushing his as I accepted the flowers, warmth blooming in my chest despite the icy weight of the stairs around us. His fiancée's face darkened, her lips parting in shock. Somewhere in the crowd, someone coughed to break the tension, but the silence that followed was louder than any outburst. Standing there with the bouquet in my hands, I realized this wasn't just a defense, it was a declaration. And judging by the look on his face, he knew exactly what it meant. The air in the room felt different after that, charged, almost electric. Guests whispered in low tones, their eyes darting between the three of us as if they were watching a drama unfold on live television. I could feel the weight of their curiosity pressing in from all sides, but my focus was on the man standing before me. He didn't rush back to his fiancée. Instead, he stayed where he was, one hand still at his side, the other brushing his suit jacket as though steadying himself. "You deserve this," he murmured, his words meant for me alone, though I caught the sharp intake of breath from the bridesmaid nearest to us. My heart raced, not because of the gift itself, but because of the way he'd said it with quiet conviction. His fiancée finally found her voice. "Are you really going to embarrass me in front of everyone?" she demanded, her tone sharp enough to slice through the murmurs in the crowd. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor, every movement calculated to reclaim control. But her eyes betrayed something else, panic. He turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "No," he said calmly. "I'm making something clear." The simplicity of the statement unsettled her, and she glanced toward the officiant as if seeking support. No one spoke. I could feel my grip on the bouquet tightening, the fresh petals soft against my skin, grounding me in this surreal moment. For the first time since I had arrived, I didn't feel like an intruder. I felt acknowledged, and that single shift in the air was more powerful than any apology could have been. She tried to laugh it off, a brittle sound that didn't match the tension radiating from her posture. "This is absurd," she announced to the guests, as though she could rewrite the scene by controlling the narrative. "She's only here to cause trouble." Her voice rang sharp, but it was met with silence. Even the string quartet, seated in the corner, had stopped playing mid-piece. The weight of dozens of eyes shifted again, some toward her, others toward him. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a grand gesture. Instead, he leaned slightly closer to me, enough that his words wouldn't carry far but the meaning would. "Don't let her diminish you," he said. My pulse stuttered at the quiet firmness in his tone. Around us, the room seemed to hold its breath. I could sense her growing desperate, her perfectly manicured fingers clenching at her gown as though gripping control by its seams. "You're making a scene," she hissed, stepping closer to him now. "Think about how this looks." He met her gaze evenly, then glanced at the bouquet in my hands. "It looks exactly how it should," he replied. The crowd shifted, a ripple of unspoken reactions passing through them. I stood there, bouquet steady, my own thoughts a tangled knot of disbelief and cautious defiance. I hadn't come here for this, hadn't imagined being in the center of something so charged. But now that I was, a strange calm anchored me. She could glare, whisper, even try to erase me from the moment, but his gesture had already altered the balance between us. And I knew that whatever happened next, it wouldn't be her version of the story that lasted. Her jaw tightened, the glossy smile she'd worn for the guests slipping just enough to reveal the fracture beneath. She stepped back, adjusting the veil on her head as if the small motion could restore her composure. But the silence in the room was no longer on her side. It had shifted, weighted toward curiosity, toward me. I felt the bouquet in my hands, each petal soft yet grounding, a reminder that I wasn't invisible here, no matter how much she wished it. He stayed by my side, an unspoken statement that didn't need banners or speeches to be understood. Guests exchanged glances, some leaning in to whisper, others openly watching the drama unfold. "You're embarrassing yourself," she finally muttered to him, her voice low but laced with venom. He didn't flinch. "No," he said calmly. "I'm making it clear who deserves respect." My breath caught at the words, not because they were loud, but because they carried weight, the kind that lingered long after the sound faded. She straightened her spine, forcing a brittle laugh toward the guests, then turned sharply, the train of her gown swishing behind her like an exclamation point to her retreat. I stayed still, unsure if I should follow, leave, or simply exist in the space I had unexpectedly been granted. The murmurs swelled again, the string quartet cautiously resuming a soft melody, though the tension clung to the air like static. And in that moment, I realized that no matter how small she tried to make me feel, there were witnesses, people who had seen him stand beside me, in front of everyone. That alone was something she couldn't undo. The rest of the ceremony unfolded like a strange dream. Soft music, polite claps, and the rustle of gowns. But my mind refused to settle. I could still feel the residual warmth of his hand where it had briefly brushed mine when he handed me the bouquet. It was ridiculous, really, how a single gesture could carve such a sharp contrast between us and everyone else in the room. I noticed the fiancée at the altar, smiling for the officiant, yet her grip on the bouquet he'd given her earlier was so tight that her knuckles paled. She didn't look at me anymore, but I could sense her awareness, the way someone feels a shadow without turning their head. The guests, too, were different now, more attentive, more divided. Some eyes held sympathy, others skepticism, but none were indifferent. My chair felt smaller somehow, and yet I sat straighter, as if refusing to be folded back into the quiet corners where I usually stayed. When the vows began, I let my gaze wander over the stained glass, letting the colors distract me from the gnawing thought that perhaps I wasn't meant to be here at all. But then his voice, steady, deep, cut through, and I found myself looking back. He wasn't looking at her when he said the word respect in his vows. He was looking at me. It wasn't romantic, at least not in the way people would think, but it was deliberate, weighted with a meaning that only we understood. A silent acknowledgement that, in a room built for her, he'd still carved out space for me. And that, I realized, was something far rarer than any bouquet. When the officiant's voice softened into the formal blessings, the air inside the church grew heavier, as though every breath carried the scent of polished wood and fresh flowers. I kept my eyes on the bouquet in my lap, fingers brushing over each petal, grounding myself in its texture. Around me, whispers threaded through the pews, low, sharp, and impossible to fully catch. I didn't need to. Their tone was enough. Some pitied me. Others were scandalized by the scene earlier. Still, I remained seated, spine unbent, the bouquet resting like a quiet declaration that I belonged here, whether they liked it or not. The fiancée shifted slightly at the altar, tilting her chin upward as if to reclaim the narrative, but her smile had stiff edges now. The CEO's gaze flickered toward me more than once, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel the weight of it. When the choir began to sing, I found myself watching him instead of the ceremony. He mouthed the words, not out of devotion, but out of habit, like a man trained for these public displays, yet always aware of the performance. And then, for a moment so brief it could have been imagined, his lips curved, not for her, but for me. It was a look that didn't promise romance or rebellion, only truth. The kind of truth that survives behind closed doors, where gestures speak louder than speeches. I realized then that no accusation, no orchestrated humiliation, could erase the quiet alliance between us. And in that certainty, my pulse steadied. This wasn't just about a bouquet anymore. It was about knowing exactly who would stand for me when the world tilted. As the vows began, the room leaned forward in collective anticipation, but I stayed rooted in my seat, the bouquet balanced like a shield across my lap. Each word they exchanged felt rehearsed, fragile, as if a single wrong note could shatter the ceremony. My eyes traced the delicate ribbon around the flowers he had given me, its end swaying gently with each shift of my hands. That ribbon was more than decoration. It was proof. Proof that, despite the accusations and the whispers, he had chosen to make a gesture visible to everyone in that sacred space. The fiancée's voice wavered slightly when she repeated the last line of her vows, her knuckles whitening around his hand. It wasn't jealousy I saw in her eyes, it was uncertainty, the kind that seeps in when control slips. I didn't flinch, didn't look away. Instead, I let my calm be my answer, knowing she felt it as clearly as the heat from the candles. The CEO, still holding her hand, glanced over the crowd again, and when his gaze found me, it lingered for a heartbeat longer than it should have. It was subtle, hidden under the veil of formality, but it was there, an unspoken acknowledgment that we both understood what had really unfolded. The choir's final notes rose and fell, the echo settling over the room like a sigh. I straightened my shoulders, knowing the real shift had already happened. The wedding might proceed, but the story everyone would remember began the moment he crossed the aisle to hand me this bouquet. And no matter how the rest of the day played out, that moment was mine. When the ceremony ended, the guests spilled into the reception hall, their conversations a mix of laughter, speculation, and hushed gossip that always seems to follow an unexpected scene. I walked in slowly, the bouquet still in my hands, its petals catching the soft light from the chandeliers above. Every table I passed seemed to pause mid-sentence, eyes flicking from me to the head table where the newlyweds would soon be seated. I could feel the weight of their curiosity. Some looked at me with pity, others with open intrigue, and a few with the sharp, cold calculation of people who enjoy drama as long as it's not theirs. The scent of fresh flowers and polished wood filled the air, mingling with the faint notes of champagne and candle wax. My seat was far from the center, tucked into the quieter edge of the room, but I didn't mind. From here, I could observe without being swallowed by the crowd. The fiancée entered first, her hand clasped around his arm, her smile fixed like porcelain. She avoided looking in my direction, though I caught the faint tremor in her jaw as they passed. The CEO, however, let his gaze slide over the room until it found me again, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his expression. For a brief moment, I wondered if he'd approach, but instead he guided her to their seats with a kind of deliberate calm that suggested he was still managing the fallout. I took a slow sip of water, steadying myself. The night was far from over, and in rooms like this, the real conversations rarely happened on the dance floor. They happened in corners, quiet, calculated, and unseen. I kept my gaze on the tablecloth, pretending to adjust the napkin in my lap while my ears searched for pieces of conversations drifting from nearby tables. She just stood there, holding it like she owned the place. One voice whispered. Another chimed in, "Well, if he handed it to her, maybe she does." Their tones wove between envy and disbelief, the way people spoke when they didn't have all the facts but craved the thrill of filling in the gaps. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, and I caught my reflection in the polished silver. Calm, composed, even regal, though my pulse drummed a quiet warning against my ribs. I'd learned long ago that in moments like this, the best power was in restraint. Across the room, the CEO leaned toward his fiancée as she gestured animatedly toward me, her lips tight. He didn't interrupt her, just listened, his thumb tapping once against the stem of his wine glass. Then, without looking away from her, he murmured something that made her grip the edge of the table. She forced a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. I took another slow breath, the bouquet resting lightly in my hand like a silent witness. Somewhere in the room, alliances were shifting, and it wasn't just between the two of them. The glances from certain guests had changed, subtle, assessing, as if they were reconsidering where their loyalties lay. That was the thing about public gestures. They rippled outward, touching people who weren't even in the original equation. And right now, I could feel those ripples reaching me. The music shifted to something softer, the kind of melody meant to ease the room into polite conversation. But the air between us stayed taut, like a string pulled too tight. I rose from my seat, bouquet in hand, and crossed the floor at an unhurried pace, aware that every step was a performance now. The CEO's eyes followed me, steady and unreadable, while his fiancée adjusted her posture, as if bracing for another blow she couldn't quite predict. I stopped just short of their table, letting the murmurs swell behind me. "Thank you," I said, my voice calm but carrying, as I held the bouquet slightly higher. It wasn't only for him. It was for the room, for every witness who needed to see that I wasn't retreating. His mouth curved into a faint smile, the kind that hinted at private victories no one else could name. "Enjoy it," he replied, tone smooth, but the weight behind it was heavier, meant for her ears more than mine. She looked away, her jaw tight, fingers gripping her champagne flute until her knuckles whitened. I could have walked away then, but I let the pause linger just long enough to mark the moment. It wasn't revenge, not exactly, it was a reclamation, a quiet reminder that respect, once given, wasn't so easily taken back. Turning, I caught the eye of a woman across the room who'd been watching with barely hidden curiosity. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and I felt the shift inside me settle into something solid. By the time I returned to my seat, the bouquet resting against my arm, I knew the night had already changed its shape. By the time dessert was served, the tension in the room had transformed into a low, humming curiosity. People kept glancing toward our table, their conversations quieting just enough to catch fragments of ours. I noticed how the CEO leaned back in his chair now, relaxed, almost as if he'd finished a battle no one else understood. His fiancée, on the other hand, had retreated into a polite mask, smiling too tightly, her laughter delayed by a beat every time someone addressed her. The bouquet lay beside me, its fresh scent mingling with the sweetness of the pastries, a symbol no one could ignore. I caught snippets of whispers. "Did you see that?" He gave it to her himself. I heard. She didn't even, each one feeding into the invisible current shifting the power in the room. I didn't need to respond, didn't need to explain. The truth was written in how people now approached me with softer eyes, with that cautious respect reserved for someone they had underestimated. Even the waitstaff moved differently around me, offering refills before I could ask. The CEO's gaze met mine once across the table, holding it for a fraction too long. And though neither of us spoke, the exchange was clear. This wasn't just about a bouquet. It was about choosing where to stand when the room expects you to shrink. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the moment root itself into memory. Tonight, I hadn't raised my voice or made a scene. I had simply existed, unshaken, and that had been enough to alter the story they would tell when they left. As the music softened and the first few couples drifted toward the dance floor, I felt the shift turn into something almost tangible. People who had avoided my gaze earlier now stopped by the table, offering small compliments or harmless questions, each one laced with curiosity. The fiancée stayed seated, her hands folded neatly over her lap, the rigid posture of someone holding herself together by sheer will. She avoided looking at the bouquet, our silent battlefield, though every so often her eyes darted toward it involuntarily. The CEO, still seated beside me, didn't rush to the dance floor. Instead, he leaned in slightly, speaking just loud enough for me to hear. "I hope you know," he said. "I wouldn't let anyone treat you like that." His tone carried no theatrics, no need for an audience. It was a statement, final and grounded. I nodded once, my throat tight, the weight of the gesture settling heavier than the bouquet in my lap. This wasn't about a grand romantic declaration, nor was it about humiliation. It was about acknowledgment, the kind that stitched invisible wounds closed without anyone noticing. Around us, laughter returned to the room. Glasses clinked, the hum of celebration resumed, but I knew the night had been marked. Somewhere between the accusation and this quiet moment, the narrative had shifted entirely. I glanced at the flowers, their petals catching the warm light, and allowed myself a small smile. People would speculate. They'd talk in circles, guess at details, invent reasons. But the truth was simple. In a room full of witnesses, someone had chosen to stand beside me when it mattered. And sometimes, that's the only thing worth remembering. When the evening finally drew to a close, the guests filed out into the cool night air, their murmurs and laughter echoing down the stone steps of the hall. I lingered near the entrance, bouquet still in hand, feeling the weight of its presence grow lighter with each step away from the crowded room. The CEO walked beside me without a word, the quiet between us carrying an ease I hadn't felt all night. Just before we reached the car waiting for him, he stopped, turned, and looked at me in a way that felt deliberate, measured. "You don't owe anyone an explanation," he said softly. Not tonight, not ever. Then, almost as if it was an afterthought, he reached for the bouquet and adjusted one loose ribbon, his fingers brushing mine. Keep it, he added, as proof that you deserve better than how you were treated. The driver opened the door for him, but he didn't move until I nodded. It wasn't a grand scene for the cameras or the kind of gesture that would end up in society columns. It was smaller, quieter, but it cut deeper. As I walked away, I noticed some of the guests watching from the curb, their expressions unreadable. The story of what happened would twist and change in their retellings, but the truth would remain with me alone. In the moment I was most publicly diminished, someone chose to restore my dignity without hesitation. I paused under the street lamp, the bouquet glowing softly in the light, and realized it wasn't just flowers I was carrying. It was the memory of being seen. And I wondered if you were in my place, would you have stayed in that room after what she said?